This is Alexa Linton, and you're listening to the Whole Horse Podcast. We're now in season 6. Thanks to all of you tuning in and sharing the podcast with your friends to keep the momentum going. This podcast is dedicated to all things horse and all things that uplift equine well-being and welfare. And I'm having down-to-earth conversations with equine professionals about the little things that move the dial slowly but surely towards a better world for horses. You'll find all the episodes, 93 and counting now, on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for being here and enjoy the ride. Hi, everybody, and welcome back. You're here for the Whole Horse Podcast, and it's Alexa here. And I'm joined today by someone that I found, which I often do, through my adventures on social media, and I saw these posts that really hit me in the feels, but also in like, yes, I'm so glad someone's talking about this and laying out the science and laying out the real kind of background of all these pieces. And so I was very drawn to reach out to Shelby Dennis. I'm very excited to have you here, Shelby.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
It's really funny that we actually live incredibly close to each other. I don't know what it is about this part of the world. But
It's as if the Pacific Northwest just attracts the same type of horse person.
absolutely. I was like, oh, she lives on the Lower Mainland. Very interesting. So that's really amazing. So I wanted to get into it today because, as I said previously, it was really drawn to your posts. I saw they got many shares, that a lot of people were really feeling resonant with what you were sharing and saying. So I wanted to chat first about this sense of this awareness that you have with horses. There seems to be so much awareness of the nuance and the complexity. I just wanted to ask what that journey to that point looked like for you.
So I started out very much not learning how to handle horses how I do now. I started out showing on the Arabian horse circuit, and I was taught things very traditionally and using very harsh, punishing methods. And I had it normalized to me from the age of 4 onwards. So it was actually, it took quite a while to start to get out of that frame of mind because I didn't know that there was other options. And it really started when I got my horse Milo from the SPCA. And he was just so difficult that what I had been taught to do with like punishing them and getting after them for unwanted behaviors and not really motivating them to do what you ask with anything that's valuable to them, it didn't work with him and it just made him worse. So I started to pursue an education through the University of Guelph, and I started taking equine sciences courses through them. And in doing so, I got access to the university library, which then let me read stuff that wasn't even necessarily specific to the courses that I initially took. And it kind of put a bug in my ear that made me start to question a lot of the stuff that I had been taught, and noticed that there was a lot of holes in what I had been taught, and that much of what I had been taught was being criticized in scientific research. And I've always been more of an analytical type of person who really values information. So when I was getting information that conflicted with what professionals in the horse industry had taught me, it didn't sit well with me. And then that kind of started the unraveling of what I had been previously taught and put into motion where I am today, where I just started noticing more and more things and then getting curious and thinking really deeply about them and then doing more exploring in and out of the classroom.
Amazing. And so for you, how long would you say that journey has been? I mean, I think a lot of people can really find themselves in this story. I know I can.
Yeah.
I started with my journey with horses not as early, but around 11, and was, going through a similar indoctrination, shall we call it. And yeah, the unpacking has taken, I don't know, like 20 years I'm on now. Like for you, what's the trajectory of that journey been?
I got Milo about 9 years ago, so it's been probably, and like even with the horse before him, I was kind of started on it. But with Milo, like the first few choices that I made was that I was like, okay, I'm not going to use like draw reins, I'm not going to use gag bits, and some of the other stuff that I had normalized the use of prior to that. So he's never actually been ridden and stuff like that. And that was probably one of the bigger shifts that started with him. But it took me longer to really shift towards using way more positive reinforcement in training, because I'd use a bit with him, but for the first several years of working with him, I did not use enough, and he still was very stressed at shows, and I still was riding him through it, even if I wasn't actively punishing him for it. So it's been a big process over the last 9 years. And I'd say it started to accelerate probably like 4 or 5 years ago, especially once I bred my first homebred foal. And I've done all the work with him with positive reinforcement, and just seeing the massive difference in how he perceives people and how he behaves and how he can handle his fear versus how Milo was able to do that at the same age when I had him. It's quite a bit different. And I'm sure that it's also influenced by the fact that Milo was massively neglected when he was quite young, and that's why he was rescued in the first place. But I definitely think that I also influenced a lot of that stress in him by creating stressful situations and then putting him in situations where it's like, oh, you just have to work through this, and he wasn't getting emotional support that he needed. So then that really sped things up. And then also within the last 3, 4, 5 years, I've really changed my management style with the horses. I have done 24/7 turnout in groups for the last 5 years, but within the last year and a half, I've also put them in a better turnout situation and started to do like a track system and add more enrichment and stuff. And then also do mixed gender herds and all that jazz. So that's also changed my perception of a lot of stuff, because I've had way more time to monitor the herds now that I live on the property with them, and then also see how different changes alter the dynamic of the herd.
Amazing. Yeah, it was actually like in my little question, mind was like, oh, is she doing track systems? So we'll come back around to that in a little bit here. I wanted to get into this. The one post that really got me was you posted an image. I'm trying to remember exactly what it said, but it's like something like dominance theory is dead or something like that. It was really like catchy, you really went there. I loved it. And what I appreciated so much about that post is you went into the detail on debunking dominance theory. Can you share a little bit about what you discovered around dominance theory and some of the research that happened there and then kind of got reversed? Yeah.
So I grew up also believing in dominance theory, even if you don't call it that, I think most horse people are, because it's like, you got to show your horse who's boss. You can't let them get away with this. You need to be the leader. And like, that's all dominance theory. But the post that I wrote was dominance theory is dead. Your horse doesn't view you as the alpha. The entire idea of being the alpha is something that we have created, because even with dogs, it doesn't hold up. The man who first coined alpha theory / dominance theory with wolves has later rescinded the entirety of his studies and has put his entire career's work into undoing the damage that he did with it. So I think that's a pretty damning statement for this research, because it's very flimsy. We're basing the entire perception of herd or pack dynamic based off of what this guy published so many years ago that he's later taken back. And the reason why he did rescind it was because, first of all, it was done on domesticated wolves, which adds additional stressors that you wouldn't see in the wild. And also, he made the mistake of not recognizing the fact that wolves are family groups. So naturally, you're going to see a certain dynamic where the older wolves, the parental figures, are going to take leadership roles because they are literally teaching their puppies. But they're not taking those roles for the purpose of asserting dominance and establishing a pecking order. And I think that's the mistake that we as people make, because our society is so dominance based and about status and developing a pecking order and being perceived as smart, like powerful or whatever to other humans. And then we project that onto our animals. And the same thing applies with horses. In wild settings, there hasn't been any clear cut and dry findings that show that horses maintain a static hierarchy. And what we have found is that they're also family groups. You do see some moving around of the groups because bachelor stallions, once they're older, might get pushed out of the herd. Sometimes they stay with their original family groups. Other times they get pushed out, but then they go and meet up with other bachelor stallions and they become friends with them before moving on and finding their own herds eventually. But it's still largely family based. And even in wild herds, what we have witnessed is that the hierarchy is fluid. any horse can initiate movement of the herd. It's not like the idea that there's a lead mare and a lead stallion that are always the ones moving the herd is not a thing. Any horse can initiate movement, and it'll be largely resource based. Like if they're running out of resources in a certain area, they'll move to go find food or water. If they sense a threat and one horse notices it first and is like, oh, we gotta go, the other horses are probably going to follow that horse. And in the domestic setting, that still applies. Like a lot of what we view to be dominance actions in domestic horses are just resource guarding. And that is an example of stressors that are introduced by our management of domesticated horses in the lifestyles that we provide with them. So like not enough hay stations, not enough water stations, too little space. And the other factor to consider as well with domesticated horses is that they don't get to choose their friends. In the wild, they can just leave and go join another herd if they don't like who they're with, or even within their herd, they can split off into subgroups and hang out with the horses that they like best. But we don't really give them that opportunity in most domesticated situations. There's some people who might have like hundreds of acres and have like 30 horses out there, and then you might see that happening because they have the space to do it. But most people don't do that. So it's very, very different. And then we label these stress behaviors and these resource guarding behaviors as attempts at dominance because generally speaking, there's going to be a horse who feels more need to protect resources. In my herd, it's my horse who is starved, which makes sense because the resources feel like they are lacking to him more often than they do to the other horses because he's had reason to believe that. But he's not doing it to assert dominance. And even still, he'll suck back and take the role of a follower in times where he's less confident because, for example, my youngster Banksy, he's braver. So when something new is put out in the field that everyone's afraid of, he's like gonna march right up to it and he's really confident, and everyone else will follow behind him in that situation because he's the more confident one, and they're like, okay, we need basically someone to hold our hand so that we can go look at this thing. So it's been super interesting for me to watch that because when I wasn't looking for it before, I would have just seen the resource guarding behaviors and go, oh, he's being dominant, he's being the alpha, da 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 da. But it's not actually within that context.
Thank you. Yeah, I've talked to a number of people about this piece, and I guess and I'm sure I can't speak for you, but it sounds like you would share my frustration of like, okay, why, when we know this is wrong, when we know dominance theory isn't a thing, do we just keep going back to it? And I know you just shared that little bit of like human beings, this is something that we actually project onto our horses because we're maybe moving through a world where we're feeling these power struggles and these dynamics. Is there any other pieces that you've seen of like why people are like, holding on to this?
I have a few theories. Like I think part of it is fear related. Like I think the whole thing about needing to boss your horse around and like punish them because they're big animals and they can like hurt you, I think that's all fear related, but people won't call it that. If you weren't afraid of your horse hurting you, you wouldn't justify hurting them first to try to stop them from hurting you. It's illogical. So I think a lot of it is fear based. I think the other thing is that for a lot of people who lack control in their lives, their horses and their management of their horses is one aspect of their life where they can exert such a complete control without it being really frowned upon by other people. Because if you did it with a child or something, people would be like, that is pretty abusive. And obviously parents still do that with children, but you can't get away with exerting this type of power dynamic with kids out in the open in public to the same extent that you can with horses. You can't even do it with dogs to the same extent. It's way more justifiable with horses for whatever reason. And I've told people outside of the horse industry the same thing. I was like, I could go and I could stand in a public square in like a horse competition arena and whip my horse in the middle of the public, and I would not get charged with anything. And while some people would watch and they would frown upon it, a lot of people would defend me, and that's not something that you can really do. Like if you were out in public kicking your dog, you would get way more criticized. So I think with horses, a lot of it comes down to the fact that people are afraid of their size, and they use a lot of these justifications to justify what they are doing to try to control an animal of this size. And it's all really flimsy excuses because from what we know from studying horses who are frightened are way more dangerous. So if we're
Yeah.
frightening them and behaving like predators to try to keep ourselves safe, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy where we're creating these unsafe situations where we get injured because our horses start to view us as a predator. And then when they are scared, they're not going to look to you for leadership and guidance because you're part of what they need to be afraid of. So I think people cling to this comfort zone of dominance theory because it makes them feel like they're in control when they really aren't. And the one crappy thing about punishment is that in the moment, if you punish your horse physically, it tends to stop what they're doing in the moment, just for that moment. It doesn't stop the behavior from happening forever, which is why you have to perpetually repeat it. But it'll make them pause because they'll be like scared and they'll go into a freeze response. And then people think that it's working. But what they don't realize is how often you're having to repeat it. Because I used to do the same thing and I'd be like, oh, it's working. But it's like, no, if it was working, I wouldn't be needing to hit my horse for nipping basically every single day for years. Like it never actually addressed the behavior. It might stop it in the moment, but it didn't actually fix the behavior. So it's a really weird dynamic that we have with alpha theory.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, as well, the other ironic piece is that just like us, you can't learn under those kinds of stressors in those kind of environments, right?
100%.
It just
And
isn't
I think,
possible.
yeah, I think that also plays into it though, because a lot of horse trainers do teach their kids under those stressors and they're really mean to their students. So I think that it might be a trauma response, but we're all taught to mask that stress and we're taught that like it's weakness to be stressed or to be afraid. And then I think people are responding to that internal trauma where they haven't been listened to. They haven't had their emotions matter by their trainer. So then when you ask them to care about their horse's emotions, they almost feel hard done by and like it's an injustice to them because they never had that from their coaches or their parents or whoever. And I think that's something that a lot of people need to start unpacking because like I grew up with that too. And I had to just ride through situations that I was terrified in because my trainers made me do it. And then when you do it, they make you feel like you're amazing for putting yourself in a dangerous situation. But then the next time, if you don't do it, or if you're scared, or if you're unsure, or if you can't manage the situation, they'll criticize the crap out of you. And it creates that, like, it creates a competitive environment. And it also makes it so that you can't really express your discomfort freely in the lesson program without being criticized for being weak.
Yeah, that brings back a lot of memories for sure. And I imagine it does for a lot of us. Like I remember, being 13 or 12 or something, young, impressionable, and just being screamed at by my riding instructor and just going, well, I guess this is just what it is. Like, this is just what happens, in these scenarios. And then being, like you say, it's like that little drop of praise. You're just like seeking it out. Like, oh my gosh, they said one nice thing. So it kind of keeps you, in this
you get like
engagement.
addicted to it because you never get it. So then
Never
it's like,
get
oh my
it.
God, like, yay. And it feels amazing when you're never getting it because it's like, whoa. And like praise always feels good, but it'll feel way more amazing when you're not getting it ever because you're like, whoa, they never say this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it starts to really make so much sense around this. There's this whole conversation about what does it mean to let our horses say no and to receive the no and to like be open to that exploration. And speaking to this, it's like, oh yeah, like we never felt safe saying no. We never felt like our no would be listened to, that it was even an option for us, right, in those spaces. And so, this sense of how do we turn around and do that for our horses when we may not even know
100%
how to do it, right? Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are afraid if they let their horse say no, that their horse will never say yes. Because I know that was something I was afraid of. And I think that's also something we need to unpack because if your horse finds hanging out with you so aversive that if you give them the choice, they would opt to never hang out with you, then it says a lot about the experience that you're giving them, as sad as that is. But pretending that that's not an issue is not a solution to the problem. It's something that just needs to be overhauled and addressed. And it does take time, but what people need to realize is like the more autonomy that a person or an animal has, and the more choice they're given to give that yes, the more often they're going to say yes. Because like I've noticed it even in interpersonal relationships. If I have friends who guilt trip me when I say no and they're passive aggressive about it, I might end up saying yes out of obligation, but I never feel good about it. And it makes me want to hang out with that person less and less and less until eventually the relationship fizzles out. But if I have friends who don't push me and who also help me out back and are really supportive friends and good and accept my no's for what they are and don't make me feel bad about it, then I'm more likely to continue saying yes in the future. And I found the same with horses, where when you don't give them the choice and you finally do, they're going to say no a lot because they've never been able to. And once they realize like, hey, wait, I actually get to do this. And then if you reward them when they come back, then they're like, wait a second. And then they start coming back and wanting to interact more and more and more.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. So I would love to know, I think there's so many people, horse people, that really want to make a shift and a meaningful shift with their horses and aren't necessarily certain how to do that or what a step would be in that direction. Is there any advice you would give that kind of person that was really wanting to, was starting to feel this sense of, okay, like, you know, maybe they have the horse that comes into their lives that, you know, similar to, it sounds like we've had a similar horse situation that way, where they're like, so this is not going to work for me.
Yeah.
You need to figure something else out. Or whatever it is, like some impetus of feeling like, okay, a change needs to happen. What would be like a piece of advice you might have for them as far as like helping them on that journey or helping them bridge that gap?
I would say like to first of all be gentle with yourself and like don't beat yourself up or expect it to be like a 180 shift, because it's kind of like you'll take a step forward and then you might take a step or two back because people like to revert to what is comfortable. So that's part of the process. But I think it starts with recognizing when you start to shift back to an unhealthy mindset and learning how to correct that sooner and sooner and sooner until eventually you stop doing it as much or at all. And that's a big part of it. The other part I would say is that sometimes it means putting a pause on your goals for a little while. Like I had goals to like show and move up the levels and do all that stuff with my horse, but he was not in a headspace where that was healthy for him. So when I started to have to consider his feelings more, I had to put all that on pause, and he ended up getting like 2 years off for hoof rehab, and he's like still slowly being brought back into work because of that. And it's like, in the past, that would have been the end of the world for me. But when I reframed my thinking and was doing more groundwork and just learning how to just like enjoy having horses, whether I'm riding them or not, it created a situation that was actually a lot healthier for both me and the horses, because it took pressure off of both of us. And there's a lot of pressure for me that I didn't even realize was there. So my recommendation to people would just be to learn how to enjoy the process, because if you can learn how to enjoy your horses when they're just sitting out in the field doing nothing, and you can find joy in just doing that, it safeguards you from having your world come crashing down if they ever become injured, or if you become injured and you can't ride. It gives you alternatives that will make it safer and still more enjoyable to have horses. Whereas if your entire enjoyment of horses is within riding them, you're always going to be in trouble because they're not going to be rideable forever. Even if it's a temporary injury, something will happen eventually, and it's going to really impact your morale if that's what you cling to. So I think it's healthy to learn how to enjoy our horses just being horses and just enjoy groundwork and stuff, because there's this narrative that groundwork's really boring and so much of the horse world doesn't want to do it, but it helps with so much stuff and it'll improve your rides, and doing all this stuff will make improvement over everything in your horsemanship. And it also makes horses more predictable. It makes them quieter, easier to deal with, and helps them enjoy the work more. So my recommendation to people wanting to do that switch is to just kind of learn how to enjoy the process, and then also learn how to like shove the opinions of other people aside unless they are actually valuable ones. Because I've noticed now, like even when my horses were really stressed, I was posting videos that would go viral because they were like bucking and like freaking out all the time, and people love watching that stuff. I got less hate then than I do now when I just post a video of me feeding my horse a cookie for putting their head in a halter. And like I don't even say anything in those videos about any other training method, but people are so angry that they just like come and they personally attack me and make fun of me and like mock what I'm doing and just like, and for people like I'm used to being on social media at this point, so it doesn't surprise me, but for people who are not used to that, it might really take them aback. But what I would encourage people to do is realize that that is an example of a problem within that person. Anyone who goes out of their way to fault you for giving your horse more autonomy or rewarding them is grappling with something within themselves that is making them super uncomfortable with the idea of allowing their horse choice or giving them rewards for doing what you want to ask. So putting those types of people's opinions into a category where it's like, this is the pile of opinions that I don't really care about, I think is important, because even people with different perspectives than you, if they're reasonable people, they don't tend to react like that. If they react like they're being attacked by what you choose to do with your own horse when it's not harming anyone, especially the horse, it's just not worth even considering, because it'll just completely exhaust you emotionally. So just do your thing and learn how to kind of commit to your own personal journey and ignore the other people.
Awesome advice. Thank you. Thank you. I think it's been a thing that I've been seeing lately more and more is, how do we say this, where I really like to encourage people to find their autonomy, I guess, in terms of, I've seen where it can get really, how do I say it, like enmeshed with, like, say a trainer, for example. Like a person may never even work a horse unless their trainer's there, or be with their horses without their trainer's advice and opinion on that experience or what's happening, right? And I wonder, like, as a trainer yourself, what is your sort of take on that? Because for me, looking at it, as a body worker, I'm like, oh, okay, that seems like just a lot of enmeshment that can have a lot of control and weirdness that can happen in that space.
Yeah, I think it's an unhealthy level of codependency. Like with any of my clients, like the goal for like any trainer would be to teach your client how to be self-sufficient enough that they don't need you all the time. And it should be a situation where you give them stuff to work on when you're not there, and then they work on it, like within reason. If they're a complete beginner or something, or they're working with a really dangerous horse where they need the support, sure, that makes sense, but it shouldn't be a forever thing. It should be a temporary thing. And what I notice in a lot of training programs is that trainers will set these rules that basically don't allow their client to do any decision making themselves, like even down to like, you can't pick your own farrier, you can't decide how your horse is like trimmed or whether they go barefoot, you don't get to pick their diet, I pick everything. And the problem with that is that a lot of these trainers are not qualified to be making those calls in an educated manner. A lot of trainers, most trainers, are not nutritionists, and most trainers do not do the outside work to learn about proper equine nutrition, and they're just making decisions based off of how they feel. And same with hoof care. Like a lot of trainers do not know what healthy hooves look like. And I would say walking from barn to barn, it's more common to see dysfunction in horse hooves and diet than it is to see people doing it right. And then their clients get dragged into that because they don't have any other choice. So I think that good trainers should be creating riders that can learn how to problem solve on their own. And if you're creating a situation where anytime your student has a problem, they have to call you and they have to get you to either come ride their horse or come be there to support them every single time, then they're not really learning anything, because they're not learning how to problem solve. And that shouldn't be what it's about. It should be about learning how to problem solve and learn skills so that when something happens, even if it's a situation that they haven't specifically dealt with before, that they have a toolbox that they can go to and go, how do I navigate this? Because even if you're in situations where you're with a trainer most of the time, it can still happen where something really unexpected happens, even when you're just walking your horse to the barn to go for your lesson. And if you don't learn how to problem solve these things, then you're putting your clients in danger and you're putting their horses in danger. So I think that whole narrative's really weird. And I think it comes down to money making in a lot of ways, because if you teach your clients how to be more self-sufficient, they might not need to hire you as often. And then the other part of it too, I think, is that a lot of trainers are wildly uncomfortable when their clients ask them questions and start to question their methods, and they take it really personally. When, in my opinion, like even if it takes you aback, if you actually know what you're talking about and you believe in what you're teaching, your client should be able to ask you just about anything, and you should be able to like give them your point and argue your position and teach them and have dialogue no matter what they ask. So even if they're saying something that completely goes against your belief system, you should be able to express yourself. And that is something I think a lot of trainers struggle with, especially when you're new. It's something that I struggled with. I used to let clients boss me around more. But I've realized now that like when you give them the autonomy to express their own opinion, even if it means like, hey, okay, you said your point. That's not something I'm willing to do. You're going to have to go find a new trainer. And you like set them free. They usually come back because they go and they try to do that and it doesn't work out. And then they learn their lesson and it's all fine and dandy after, because then they listen to you better the next time and they're more open to different perspectives. But yeah, there's a really unhealthy level of codependency in the average lesson barn and training program. And I'm very grateful that I left that situation when I did, because I think there's so much toxicity within those situations, unless the trainer in charge really makes an effort to not have that happen.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, a lot of people don't do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally. Well, I really appreciate your perspective on that. And it leads me to my next thing that I am really personally exploring right now and feeling very passionate about, which is like environment, the role of environment in health and, the overall well-being of our horses. Because, I think we can relate to this living on the Lower Mainland, like rainforest area, and like on Vancouver Island here as well. It is way too common to see horses living in tiny paddocks, if that.
Yeah.
Stalled. I know of a place down in Victoria that I've heard like they literally have 40 horses on less than an acre at this moment.
Oh my God.
It's nuts, right? Like, and you start to think about that. It's like little matchboxes, like horses living in the size of a closet, essentially, barely turn around. I would love to get your opinion on, like, because I've been sort of thinking on this level of like, okay, how do we help people to move towards a different type of horse care that is much more for the horse? And why are people so reluctant or so stuck in this, little stall, tiny paddock, flat footing, sterile footing situation, like, or mindset, right? Like what are the things that we can like help people to do to kind of start to make that change, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of it again comes down to fear. Like people like and I used to be like this too, and now I kind of make fun of it because I'm like, that is so silly, where like you panic when you see your horse running and it's like they're horses, like they're supposed to be running. But like when you don't let them go outside and don't let them have space, then yeah, they do run around in a very alarming way because they're letting off so much energy they haven't been able to expel. And I personally hate watching that. Like when I get horses off the racetrack and you turn them out for the first time, it is scary because they don't have as much self-preservation as a horse who lives outside. But that is a problem that we have caused, and it's our job to fix that problem rather than just be like, oh, they're like this now, so we just gotta continue treating them this way. And it's the same thing with horses who are aggressive to other horses. If you never socialize an animal and then you just like throw them out into a highly stimulating area and you don't teach them how to react in that area, they're probably going to make bad decisions. So the way I try to explain it to people is like, if you get a new horse who you want to make into a jumper and they're stopping at every jump, they're spooking at every jump, you're not just going to go, oh, they hate jumping, I give up. I know I've spent 10 grand on this horse, but he clearly doesn't want to be a jumper. I'm not even going to try to alter this behavior at all. Whatever. No, you try to fix it and you try to adapt the behavior, and people will do it in all sorts of crazy ways, even if it's like harsh, abusive equipment. And they'll make it happen because it's what they want to do. And if we're not willing to put more work than that into helping our horses live healthy lifestyles, then it isn't really about what's best for the horse. It's about what's easiest for us. And I think that's a really important distinction that everyone needs to make, because if you're not willing to put the work in to help your horse adjust to a lifestyle that is healthier for them, like provably so, because again, like with the whole stalling thing, Another thing that I always try to tell people is that, like, outside of old age, the number one killer of horses is colic. It's what everyone is afraid of, and overwhelmingly so. Stalled horses colic and die way more than any pasture reared horse you will find. And while you can still have colics when horses are out on pasture, like, anyone who's moved from the stall barn environment to 24/7 out turnout can speak for how much less they see any cases of colic, even if we're just going to look at anecdotes, but the studies also support that. So what I would encourage people to do is to, one, not be complacent, and to look at the research and really consider, like, if you want your horse to last and to be healthy and to be sound and to be at the least risk of behavioral or physical problems, look at the research, because it unequivocally shows the healthiest way to keep horses. There is no debate there, unless the information does a complete 180 pivot and starts to go the other, which it has not. So until that actually starts to happen, not even worth discussing. We have to look where the information lies, even if it makes us uncomfortable. I think the other side of this is that people feel kind of stuck and helpless because, like, in the Pacific Northwest, for example, a lot of boarding barns do not offer group turnout, and you only have the stall paddock situation. And since that's what a lot of boarders only have access to, then they start to defend that lifestyle because they feel like they have no other options. And I think the important takeaway for that is that if boarders start to demand a certain level of care and everyone becomes aware of that, even if it takes time, there's going to have to be a shift. And I don't really think lack of space is an excuse, because I've seen in European paddock paradises that people can set up really enriching enclosures on like an acre, and it makes it look like it's way more than an acre because of how they set up the track system. So it's within our power to do here. And honestly, knowing how much it costs to perpetually resurface these little square paddocks when horses dig them up and destroy them
and destroy the fences.
Exactly. Like, you can fix it, and it would be like it would be more of a lump sum than you would be picking away at all those other little expenses. But you'd also save money on colic bills and like other vet bills and just like horses injuring themselves, because also, like, when they're outside and they're turned out and they're moving around more, they don't experience as much soundness issues. So I think that we just need to start having that shift and look where the information is, rather than just like telling ourselves what we are most comfortable hearing, because the information is like so cut and dry and obvious when it comes to horse management and turnout, that it's really sad that we've gotten to the point where people think it is normal to not only keep horses isolated and alone, but to keep them in such small enclosures, because it makes absolutely no sense when you look into how their bodies actually function. And when you look into the research.
And I was going to say, and the other one is I consistently see horses as being essentially starved.
Oh yeah.
Consistently, and that's very common as well. Oh, they're fat. And this sense of, like, okay, do they have access to forage? This is the other piece with colic, right? When the horse goes for, over 4 hours without food in their system, bad things happen. The cortisol levels go through the roof. There's a big change in their physiology. And I see this all the time with people that, oh, my horse has all these behaviors. So how long are they standing with nothing at all to eat? Nothing to even pick at, because their paddock is pure gravel.
Yeah, and then they just start eating the wood too, and then people are like, "Oh, they're destroying my fence. Let's put on like a muzzle on them or whatever." And the thing about that too is it's so easy. Like, even if your horse is fat, just get a slow feed hay net and just fill it. Because it's also less work. For like the other part that I don't get about boarding facilities wanting to do that is, like, it is less work. You don't have to have people coming out 3 times a day to feed if you get every horse a bale net and just fill it once in the day. And like, per horse, if you actually give them a whole bale, you're not even going to need to refill it every day in most cases. And you can control like how big the holes are depending on what the horse needs, and it's easier for everybody involved. So like, it makes absolutely no sense to me. And I think it comes down to people haven't even tried to see if that solution works. They've already decided it hasn't, and then they don't even want to bother trying. Which is sad, but it's such an easy fix.
I saw a post from Lockie the other day, and it was basically like, my horses get fit in their environment, and then the training is just like the cherry on top. And I thought, like, it was something along those lines, like, their movement needs should be met
Oh yeah.
ideally by their environment and not by you taking them out for an hour in a day and hacking them out.
Yeah.
Because that, like all of those other times where they have the opportunities to build their proprioception and their joint strength and their tendons and their body in general, right? To be resilient and
100%.
strong and aware. Yeah, I really
Well,
feel that.
yeah, and even if we're working them really hard in that hour, even if you work them for 2 hours, it's never going to make up for the amount of distance that they can cover in a 24-hour period when they're given the chance. And I used to not get it either because I'd see posts of people being like, oh, my horse hasn't been ridden in like 3 months. And then we were taking them out. And I'd be like, that is so unfair. Your horse is so unfit. But I wouldn't look at the fact that the horse is out in a herd on 100 acres, is probably covering like 12 kilometers or more per day, and is substantially more fit than my sport horses that I'm working 6 days a week that are in little paddocks. And I think that's where like people get so stuck, is they can't comprehend how that lifestyle would actually work to keep a fit horse. Because like it even nowadays, it kind of still surprises me. Like I had some rocks delivered a week or so ago, and the truck scared some of the horses. So they were, and it was also a big weather change. So they were really fresh. And like my thoroughbred mare, who have not worked a ton over the last year and a half, and she's just coming back into work, she was like doing a circuit around her field with like the two babies she's out with, and was just like galloping and like jumping over ditches and stuff for probably like 5 minutes, which isn't that long, but she was going fast. And then she stopped and she was like, she was breathing, but she was not even sweating. And I was like, what the heck? I was like, that's wild. She's not done anything. Like, why is she not even sweaty? And then like the two babies were sweaty because they're also less fast than her, but like I was like, wow. And it was just like kind of like one of those things where I was like, oh, that's surprising to me, even like knowing how fit they stay on their own in the field, that she stayed that fit. And it also is nice then too, because then when I give them the winter off when the weather is bad, like I don't have to do this whole reconditioning program that someone, if their horse was stalled all winter, would need to do. And they're also like less stiff. It's so much better for everyone involved. And I don't think people realize how many different moving parts there are, because even with like hoof health, for example, like it's next to impossible to get your horse to have healthy feet if they're not moving around. Like unless they're really naturally gifted. And even then, their hooves are still going to suffer from what they would be like if they were out 24/7. And I think people almost need to like immerse themselves in that environment and actually see how it works, because they get so stuck on the fact like my horse is different. It doesn't work for every horse. And like there's all these little excuses. Like, and I used to use them too. So it's not really a judgment on anyone so much as an observation, because it's just, but it is an excuse, because people aren't even willing to try these solutions before they've already decided that they don't work.
Yeah, for sure. It's yeah, I'm so hopeful. I even wrote an article about it. I'm like, come on, people, like just even a little bit. What's a little step that you can do in this direction, right?
And then once they try it, they'll be really amazed by how well it works, and then they'll want to do more, because like that's kind of what happened to me. I'd start trying all these little things, and I just realized how much of a difference it would make, and I was like, oh my God, like, and it's something where I'm still learning, right? Like I was taught too, even when I had my horses out full time, that like gendered groups was the way to go, that like geldings go out with geldings and mares go out with mares. And I've started doing mixed gendered herds within the last year. And even just more recently, like I put my Mustangs out with the rest of the herd so that they balanced out the gender dynamic, even though it was already a more mixed gender herd. And they made the herd dynamic even healthier by balancing it like that. And I found that exceptionally interesting. So I was like, cool. I wasn't expecting it to be that easy of a transition, because it's also probably harder for the Mustangs because they're so well socialized compared to the average domesticated horse. So I was really concerned about there being problems with the ones that are not as well socialized, because they would be like, what are you doing? But they balanced out the whole dynamic, and it was just like everyone was happier. And I was like, that's really cool. And it was something that I had drilled into my head from a relatively young age to not believe in.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, you have a mare herd and you have a gelding herd, or whatever, right?
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
sense of, no, there's like this beautiful balance that can happen. And I've seen so many herds now where I'm like, oh man, like it works just so well to have, in these certain scenarios where we can work with it well. It's like it works super
Oh,
well for
so
them.
well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even with stallions too, a lot of people think that stallions have to be like alone because that's what we've normalized. It's like that is why they're all so crazy and
Yeah.
can't hold it together around horses. Like if you keep a horse isolated all the time and then you bring them to a show, expecting them to be able to manage that well is not particularly fair because
Yeah.
it would be so overstimulating, especially when they have all those hormones that they're having to work through as
Yeah.
well. But again, it just comes down to us caring enough to want to do better by our horses.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was one other piece that I wanted to touch on. Well, maybe more than one, but it was around the article you posted around sudden or premature weaning and like the potential long-term effects on, not only social ability to do social engagement, but also these other pieces that can happen around this. And as a equine therapist, I mean, oh gosh, I think I work a lot with trauma and different things, and I find that this is one of the number one things that comes up for horses around, like, yeah, things that really impacted them in a huge way in their lifetime. So yeah, can you share a little bit more about some
Yeah.
of the research you've done or some of the learning you've done about this?
So what I like with the weaning thing too, it comes down to the horses being herd animals thing. And I think it's compounded, like stressful weaning is made worse by the fact that like once weaned, a lot of horses, people will remove from a social environment as soon as they're like older. Like you might keep your yearling and like weanling in a group turnout situation, but as soon as they enter training, they're oftentimes removed from that group situation. And then that makes it worse because they go from having their mom as like their constant and like as their support system and their friend. And a lot of people wean cold turkey without thinking about the implications of that. So then they're taken away from their mom all at once. And if they're lucky enough to be put with other weanlings or other horses, then that kind of dampens the damage it does a little bit. But then again, when you're putting all these now orphaned babies out together who were just learning how to develop social skills and are now out with all these socially dysfunctional babies who are also traumatized, they're not going to learn healthy behaviors from those horses. And then from there, it's like once they're no longer babies, a lot of people will just be like, okay, now it's time to be an individual turnout and go into your stall and paddock and start training. And then it's like, they're really not learning how to socialize. So then you have these now adult horses who, if you do try to put them with other horses, might display aggression and other resource guarding behaviors or just be really scared. And that's also where I think the aggression can stem from. If they don't know what to do and they're really intimidated and afraid of other horses, they can respond aggressively out of reactivity. So I don't think we fully appreciate just how much we traumatize horses by weaning them, because in a natural situation, the dam will start to wean the baby on their own. And if you watch like horses who are lucky enough to grow up with their moms in herds with other babies and other mares and other horses, even at like the 3, 4, 5, 6 month mark, you'll start to see them get more distance from their moms and be like quite a ways away, but they're still in the same turnout area if they have the space to do so. And they'll go and seek their mom when they need to nurse, but then they kind of just go off and do their own thing. And they're kind of self-weaning and learning how to adjust to that dynamic on their own. And it makes it less scary. And I also, in my opinion, I don't know if there's enough research on this yet, but I think it decreases herd bound issues because they learn how to remove themselves from different horses in the herd and get comfortable doing so, and then put themselves back in the herd as they see fit without it being like a big deal where it's like, oh, when I'm gone, and now I have to panic. So I think by altering how we go about weaning, we could actually decrease herd bound issues, because like even just looking at it logically, if you were a child and one day out of the blue, someone's like, okay, I'm like, they take your mom and you never see her again and you're just by yourself, it's going to create anxieties that like when your friends that you're really attached to leave after that, you're going to panic and worry that they might not be coming back because that's what happened to you. And that's a little anthropomorphic in the way that I'm referencing it, but we know that horses are highly social herd animals. We know how much they rely on the social dynamic for comfort. So we should be able to look and kind of imagine and empathize how it would feel for us to have the same thing happen, where you have someone who is like a focal point in your life just removed suddenly, and it would create trust issues and attachment issues. And there's been like a few studies that I've read on attachment with horses and how like it disrupts the attachment dynamic the way we go about weaning. And it totally makes sense because there's so much psychological studies on attachment theory in people. And while horses are not people, I think we kind of do need to start to reference some human studies and just start to consider how they could apply to other animals that have similar social dynamics, because no one ever really questions the fact that we use animals for human studies and we do a lot of testing on animals when we're developing human drugs. But as soon as you start to go like, oh, maybe these animals can experience similar emotions to people, they'll be like, animals aren't people. And it's like, well, they're close enough that we use them for a lot of human psychological studies and a lot of our testing for medicines as well. So they clearly are close enough to being humans that we see them as a viable means of finding out more about humans before we test on humans. And I think that kind of weaning plays into that. So we disassociate emotionally from how we emotionally impact our horses, and we try to downplay the impact of it under the assumption that they're so much less intelligent than us, that they're not capable of feeling this hurt to the degree that we are, when there's absolutely no evidence of that. And when we see rampant examples of the damage that is done everywhere, I think that that's the issue with like weaning, is like you'd be hard pressed to find and purchase a horse anywhere that doesn't have trauma from their weaning period. Like even with breeding farms that do it in better ways, it still tends to be traumatic unless they go about it really slowly. And when you're operating as a business, it's really hard to go about it slowly enough that you're not doing damage. So I'd say like it's a trauma that the vast majority of horses have experienced and that we really underrepresent in terms of how damaging it is to the horses.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's so important what you shared about, like the research and this whole term anthropomorphism, to me is a way of disconnecting from, like you say, dissociating from the experience and the emotionality of our horses. And I mean, we literally have the same nervous systems. Like the function is exactly the same.
Yeah.
That's, down to like all of it. And then this community minded, they live in those community groups. It's so similar. So I really appreciate you sharing around that. And for people, we have to wrap up here in a couple minutes, but for people that, like you said, most people have horses that have had trauma around weaning. Do you have any, little nugget for those people, any ways that they can support that horse to feel better, more healthy, more happy in themselves?
Oh, for sure. I would say that the big thing is like to keep in mind that horses are herd bound. Like they're supposed to be herd bound. So even in an ideal situation, us getting frustrated about the fact that they want to be with the herd is pretty silly, because it's like that shows that your horse is genetically superior in the sense that they are responding to the environment in a way that would make them less likely to die if they were living out in the wild, because they need to stay in a herd. So if we're going to work with herd animals and expect them to be able to leave the herd, one, we need to be a safe place for them. And we cannot be a safe place if we're behaving like a predator and we're disciplining them for being afraid of things or being stressed. We cannot be a safe place if we're punishing them for whenever they feel uncomfortable, because then anytime they start to get up, they have more reason to get explosive and afraid because they can predict a punishment potentially happening. So being the safe place and helping them emotionally regulate is really important. And then the other part of that is that since they are herd animals, if we're going to ask them to leave the herd and be alone, we need to condition it slowly in the same way we would anything else. So if your horse starts getting stressed as soon as they leave the field, don't be like, okay, we're going to go marching all the way away from your friends where you can no longer see them. Like, work on getting them to self-regulate outside the field wherever they first start getting up, and get them to let down there before you move further away. Because otherwise what people inadvertently do is they create a situation where they take their horse so far away from the herd that they get so anxious, and that the only time they fully let down from that anxiety is when you put them back. And then when that's just conditioning the idea that they need to be with their friends in order to feel safe. And it creates a larger issue over time where you're teaching them that they feel unsafe anytime they leave, and that the only time they can feel safe again is when they're back with their friends. So being a support system for your horse and helping them overcome trauma, I think, starts with being like a safety net for them. Like that's what we should be. Is we're not their leaders, we're like their partner and their safety net. We're there to hold their hand in times of stress, not to be a predator. So it kind of goes back to dominance theory in a way where it's like we cannot be their safety net if our perception is about dominating and controlling their behavior rather than helping them control their own behavior through appealing to their emotions and helping them self-regulate. Because once you've already started to get to the point where you're having a whole meltdown and a tantrum, as anyone can imagine, when you're that upset, it's way harder to bring yourself down. You have to go through that whole process of like sobbing and crying and let it all out before you start to self-regulate. But if you catch yourself before you hit that point of overwhelm, you can self-regulate much more effectively. And the same applies to horses. So the goal should just be to not have them get to that point in the first place. And as the highly intelligent species that we are, with the access to studies on horses that we have, we should be able to do that. Horses can't look us up on the computer and learn about why we operate the way that we do. So they just have to be confused about the way we act, but we can learn about them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shelby. This has been a great conversation. I'm so
Thank you so much. Same here. Yeah, it's always nice to talk to people with similar mindsets because it's and you always learn something too, because it's just interesting to see the different perspectives. And I think also the fact that we live on the Pacific Northwest, it's like very similar dynamic in terms of boarding facilities and what we see, which is particularly interesting to me because I would love to see changes made, and the more people doing track systems, hopefully more people will see. So
absolutely. I'm working on it. We're working on it.
Perfect.
Amazing. Well, thank you everybody for listening in. Shelby, can you share how someone might get in touch with you if they wanted to reach out?
I'm on website milestoneequestrian.ca where you can find me, and that has a lot of my social pages linked. And then I'm also on Instagram and TikTok as SD Equus. That's SDEQUUS. And then just YouTube under my name, Shelby Dennis, or Facebook as Milestone Equestrian. So there's lots of ways to find me and my other stuff that I have. I have a podcast called Making Milestones. And then I also just wrote and published a book last year called The Other Side of Horsemanship, which goes into more depth on like how my mindset shift started and what factors I think played into that. So those are kind of the pages you can look for.
Amazing. Thank you once again. All right, everyone.
Thank you
for listening in, and we will see you next time. Okay, bye for now.